So this is disparate impact. In housing, there's lots of areas that there might be disparate impact, and HUD recently came out with some guidance on criminal background checks. Now we start thinking, well, of course I can exclude criminals from my property. I don't want somebody that's going to steal from me or break into my tenants' apartments or, harass or actually, do violence on some of my other tenants. So of course I can check on that. Well, HUD has looked at the numbers and said, this will have a disparate impact. Now, the reason it has a disparate impact is beyond us as real estate professionals. It's what our society has done in terms of law enforcement. And so a much higher proportion of some of our population has experienced the criminal justice system in a way that they now have a criminal record. And this makes housing more difficult. So HUD has issued some guidance that says you can't have a blanket policy on arrests. Now that makes sense because we're innocent until proven guilty, right? So we shouldn't be looking at arrests. And then the second thing it says is if you have a policy based on criminal background, it has to be reasonably connected to a business reason related to that housing decision that has to be made. And one example that I've used, you have two people, well, somebody that's coming to rent an apartment and the criminal background check says that they were convicted of arson. Now, you might say, it's pretty reasonable to exclude somebody that's been convicted of arson, right? However, when you look at it more deeply, one of them was convicted of arson because when they were 19 years old, they went on a camp out and didn't put out the fire and it started a forest fire and they got convicted of arson. The other one burned down the apartment because they didn't like the landlord. Now, clearly there's one that their arson conviction has no relationship to being a good tenant, and clearly there's one that their arson conviction does. So what HUD is saying is you have to be very careful at tailoring your policy so that it applies to a legitimate business need that's reasonable to connect. They're not saying you can't do criminal background checks. And that's the disparate impact laws don't say you can't do something that has a disparate impact. They're saying if something has a disparate impact, you have to look at it and determine what your legitimate, non-discriminatory reason for that policy is. And then if there's a less discriminatory way to achieve that policy, you have to use that. Now that's a big mouthful for us. So I want to put your minds at ease a little bit. It is very difficult to prove that something has a disparate impact. Number one, it takes an incredible statistical analysis, and that's difficult. Not just everybody walking down the street can pull out statistics. Secondly, there has to be a correlation between your policy and that impact. They can't just say, well, people are, this particular group are less likely to live here, and it has nothing to do with your policy. They can't say that your policy has a disparate impact. There has to be a correlation there. Once they prove that, your job, if you're the one being accused, is to identify that legitimate business reason for that policy. And then the burden shifts back to the other side to say, but you could have done it better. And since they can do that, good preparation, good due diligence would be, can I do it better another way? So I'll throw something else out. How many of you recall the discussion that we had a few years ago about whether you would need 20% down to get a qualified mortgage? Okay? Now, what would 20% down do to most of your first-time homebuyer market? Put them out. So they would have, it's a non-discriminatory policy. Everybody has to have 20% down. I don't care who you are. But it had a disparate impact on first-time homebuyers, but also on buyers from certain ethnic groups. And when you think about the Hispanic population and the Asian population, which is so heavily millennial, it had a heavy impact just on age distribution, on multicultural populations. So what's the legitimate reason to say that you need a 20% down? The conventional wisdom is that's a good predictor that you're going to pay your mortgage. But when we studied it, in fact, it's not a predictor. The predictors are you employed? And will you be employed? And credit. How do you handle your credit? So I went to somebody at HUD, and when they were proposing this in the government, they all talked to each other, and I went to the assistant secretary, who I knew pretty well, and I said, have you done a disparate impact analysis on the 20% down? And he said, I don't know if we have, because he wasn't involved in that detail. Well, sure enough, it disappeared from the discussion. Because why? If you're concerned about the mortgage being paid, there's other ways that are less discriminatory to find out if you can pay your mortgage. So think about that with your policies. If you have a policy that is necessary to conduct business, there's a legitimate reason for it, do a little quick analysis. Is this going to impact part of our market? And if it does, say, well, I know the policy is legitimate. Can I achieve that goal with a less discriminatory policy or action?